Another SBU operation. The bridge is cracking at the seams, a new web, but this time in Crimea. Here's why he flew in for the parade. The secret agreement between Xi Jinping and Putin has been leaked. This is insane. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian delegation is already in the US. This visit will change everything. The US will destroy Russia. Shocking details about the SBU's super operation. Russia's actual losses are already known. Ukrainian aviation is on fire, and meanwhile, Ukraine is losing an ally. Poland is a traitor, and a conflict awaits us. Ukrainian martyrs. Engineers were shocked. Botyari instead of Gerans. All this and more, watch in this episode of Hotspot. Another SBU operation. There is panic in Russia. Crimea is engulfed in hellish fire, and the Kerch bridge is no longer functional. 1,100 kilograms of explosives, and the bridge is cracking at the seams. Officially, the structure is on the verge of collapse. Crimea is next. A new web is coming. Exclusive footage and details coming up right now. Don't go anywhere. Meticulous work by the Security Service of Ukraine. 3 attacks on the Crimean Bridge. Strikes came from both air and water.
Crimea was shaken by a series of explosions. The Security Service of Ukraine struck the Crimean Bridge for the 3rd time. This time, intelligence agents planted explosives on the bridge supports. The special operation was carried out underwater. As a result, the occupiers restricted traffic for several hours. The Defense Ministry reported that 8 drones were destroyed overnight over Russian regions and the temporarily annexed Crimea. Is Operation Web 2 really brewing in Crimea? At the very least, preparations for it are underway there. After the explosions at Russian airfields, planes and helicopters were massively scrambled from military airfields in Crimea. According to Ukrainian intelligence, the carriers of tactical nuclear weapons in Crimea could be Russian airplanes, helicopters, as well as submarines, ships and boats based there.
At present, there has been no recorded deployment of the occupier country's nuclear weapons on the territory of occupied Crimea. However, it should be noted that even without nuclear capabilities, the territory of Crimea is essentially considered a continuous military base for the occupying country's army. Therefore, there are enough legitimate military targets to carry out operations of this nature.
Let us recall that on June 1st, the Security Service of Ukraine conducted a historic special operation in Russia. Simultaneously, 4 military airfields in the rear of the aggressor's side were struck, resulting in the loss of dozens of aircraft worth $7 billion. Meanwhile, Russia published a so-called peace memorandum, which it handed over to Ukraine during negotiations in Istanbul. It includes 3 sections with 2 options for ceasefire conditions and 31 points. The first option for a ceasefire, the complete withdrawal of the Ukrainian army from Russian territory, as well as from the entire territory of the Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson and Zaporizhzhia regions.
This refers to territorial concessions by Ukraine. Moreover, the Russian Federation is claiming even those areas of the Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia and Kherson regions that are under the control of the Ukrainian Defense Forces, and which the Russian army is unable to control, meaning they cannot break through the defenses of the Ukrainian Defense Forces. The Russian political leadership is well aware that from a military standpoint, it is impossible to achieve the objectives of occupying the territory of the Donetsk region.
The second option includes provisions on prohibiting the redeployment of troops, halting mobilization and the supply of foreign military aid to Kyiv, as well as initiating demobilization.
Halting mobilization activities would in fact disrupt both the rotation of personnel and the replenishment of operational reserves for the Ukrainian Defense Forces. The same situation applies to the cessation of military and military technical support from our strategic partners. In other words, the Russian Federation fully understands that the ability to resume the logistical component of military technical support, if it is halted, could have a serious impact on the current situation directly at the line of contact.
In addition, the document stipulates Ukraine's neutrality, its refusal to join NATO, the holding of elections, international recognition of the Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson and Zaporizhzhia regions, as well as Crimea as Russian and other such nonsense.
The remaining points of the so-called memorandum from the Russian delegation on the demilitarization of Ukraine indicate that, in fact, the proposals from the Ukrainian side are being completely disregarded. Let me remind you, the Ukrainian memorandum, the issues of demilitarization or reducing the size of the armed forces of Ukraine are, in fact, taken out of the negotiation process. A similar situation applies accordingly to the so-called neutral status of Ukraine.
Meanwhile, the situation in the north of the Sumy region continues to deteriorate. The analytical project Deep State has reported that Russian occupation forces have captured Konstantinovka. Several other settlements are also under threat.
At the moment, the main threat of further advancement by Russian troops in the Sumy region is their potential to gain direct control over the settlement of Yanokiivka. This settlement is the largest logistics hub for the armed forces of Ukraine. The Sumy-Yanokiivka-Sudza highway is used for rotating personnel, delivering ammunition, and evacuating the wounded. This includes units of the Ukrainian Defense Forces concentrated in the territories of the Kursk and Belgorod regions.
Meanwhile, official Washington is warning that after Operation Web, Russia may launch new strikes against Ukraine's energy system.
That's why he came to the parade. The secret has come out. Xi Jinping accidentally revealed a secret agreement with the Kremlin, signed right during the parade. A new Molotov-Ribbentrop pact between Russia and China. The deception was uncovered, even though the Kremlin tried to cover its tracks. Now everything is clear. Watch the episode for details.
Russia hid on the Kremlin website the declaration signed with China during Xi Jinping's visit, even though it was publicly announced.
As a result of the talks between the President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, and the Chairman of the People's Republic of China, Xi Jinping, a joint statement of the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China on global strategic stability was adopted.
At the same time, the text of the declaration is available on the website of the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The text explicitly states that the countries support the principle of non-violation of territorial integrity.
The People's Republic of China and the Russian Federation reaffirm the principle that states must refrain from the threat or use of force in violation of the Charter of the United Nations and consequently condemn unilateral military interventions not based on individual or collective self-defense.
At this point, Russia's dependence on China is so great that essentially China doesn't really have to take Putin's opinion into account anymore.
This is not the only document that the Chinese have shamefully forced the Russians to agree to. For example, according to another declaration, it turns out that China is the main ally who helped defeat Nazi Germany. And this is happening while, for example, Trump has claimed Victory Day as his own. Pay attention to Putin's facial expression.
Victory was achieved largely thanks to us. Whether you like it or not, we entered this war and we won it. Many wonderful allies helped us, but we were, without a doubt, the dominant force in that war.
80 years ago, against the fierce militarists and Nazis, the armies and peoples of China and Russia fought selflessly side by side, writing a majestic chapter in human history and covering themselves with undying glory.
As the main theaters of military operations in Europe and Asia, the Soviet Union and China bore the brunt of the assault from Hitler's Germany, along with its satellite states united under its banner, and militarist Japan becoming the two key forces in the fight against fascism and militarism.
China aimed to show the United States that essentially, within the first 100 days after his inauguration, Trump failed to achieve his main foreign policy goal, to pull the Russian Federation away from China. That's all? And moreover, they demonstrated that, well, I think the Russian Federation has never been so dependent on China as it is now. In other words, this dependence has only deepened.
Putin is aware of his dependence on China, which is why he silently agrees even with subtle hints that it's time to end the war in Ukraine. China supported a 30-day ceasefire.
Our talks with the President of the People's Republic of China took place in a traditionally warm, friendly, and constructive atmosphere, and were very substantive and productive.
China still believes that dialogue and negotiations are the only viable way out of the crisis. China will continue, in light of the will of the parties to the conflict, to work with the international community in order to play a constructive role in the final resolution of the crisis and the achievement of lasting peace.
China will continue this Confucian, if I may call it that, policy. It will wait, it will work through soft power, and it will most likely support the option that, one way or another, the parties agree upon during the negotiation process.
There is only one conclusion. Russia is not as great as it tries to portray itself. After all, Xi Jinping literally twisted Putin's arm, forcing him to sign the papers. Moreover, Putin was so humiliated by them that he didn't even dare to publish the documents.
New shocking details about Operation Web. How much Russian strategic aviation was actually destroyed. Exclusive footage of Ukrainian aviation striking the enemy. The offensive in Sumy, a shock. The enemy is already within range of tube artillery fire. The Russians are preparing for an assault. What are the prospects for this plan? Find out in this episode. Here are thrilling shots of Ukrainian aviation striking the enemy. A Su-27 destroyed an enemy air defense missile system during a combat sortie. It was during the execution of a combat mission that a Su-27 of the Ukrainian Air Force destroyed a Russian surface-to-air missile system. This happened during a sortie to cover a strike group. The aircraft belongs to the 39th Tactical Aviation Brigade. The successful destruction of the air defense system was an important contribution to ensuring the safety of Ukrainian strike aviation in the combat zone. Meanwhile, fury turned May into a living hell for the occupiers. In May, the skies over the enemy truly belonged to Ukraine. The UAV operators of the Luhansk Assault Regiment from the Joint Assault Brigade of the Ministry of Internal Affairs LUT put on a real feast for Ukrainian drones and a hunt for the invaders. 79 Russian occupiers experienced Ukrainian hospitality firsthand. They were either killed or wounded by precise airstrikes, while enemy equipment was left in flames and ashes. Attempts at rotation and resupplying ammunition were thwarted right from the start. And these are not just numbers. They are the result of surgical precision, iron discipline, and predatory determination. Every strike is a cold calculation and a warrior's passionate heart. The unit operates with the skill of a surgeon and the relentlessness of a storm. If May was a black month for the enemy, then June promises to become a true fiery hurricane. Ukrainian falcons know no rest. They have the wings of vengeance and the eyes of justice. And now, how, according to experts, is Operation Web affecting Russia's missile capabilities? According to experts, Russia still retains the potential to launch massive missile strikes against Ukraine. However, this potential has become more limited. They believe that Operation Web, aimed at disabling Russian strategic bombers, is primarily significant in the long term and will not lead to an immediate collapse of the enemy's strike capabilities. The exact scale of the damage remains unclear. It is not known exactly which types of aircraft were hit and what condition they were in. Experts emphasize that Russian aviation is mainly based on outdated equipment, such as the Tu-95, which is no longer in production. Losses among aircraft with limited service life can significantly affect combat capability. Nevertheless, it is too early to speak of a complete loss of the ability to carry out massive strikes. Russia still has the means for such attacks, but their quantity and quality are likely decreasing. It is possible that part of the aviation will be reserved in case of a potential conflict with NATO. At the same time, experts urge caution when assessing the current results of the operation. Many conclusions are drawn based on incomplete data, such as satellite images, which can distort the real picture. But according to preliminary estimates, about 12 to 13 aircraft have been hit. However, the actual number may be higher, especially considering the possible concealment of losses in the first hours after the raid. Thus, the effect of Operation Web is still unfolding, and its consequences for Russian strategic aviation will only become clear over time. Meanwhile, in the Sumy direction, Russia is increasing the pressure. It is also known that the enemy struck the city of Sumy with long-range Tornado-S multiple launch rocket systems using cluster munitions. Russian forces are increasing the intensity of offensive operations in the north of Sumy region, advancing 12 to 15 kilometers deep. Such a distance potentially allows the use of artillery and drones to strike directly at the city of Sumy. This is exactly what we saw in the morning, when the Russians launched a strike with multiple launch rocket systems. Additionally, according to analysts, the offensive is taking place in 3 directions at once, to the north and northeast of the regional center. Geolocated materials confirm the advance of Russian forces near Andreevka and Yablonovka. It is also reported that several settlements have been captured, specifically Alexeyevka, Novomikhailovka, and Kondratievka, and that there is an advance toward the outskirts of Konstantinovka. An increase in the number of ground attacks is also being recorded in the areas of Andreevka, Yunakovka, and Miropolye. These actions are accompanied by artillery strikes and the use of drones, which may indicate preparations for an assault on the city. Nevertheless, according to experts, a full-scale capture of Sumy in the near future is unlikely. Russian forces remain limited, while the defense of Sumy has been reinforced. In this direction, units from various Russian motorized rifle, naval, and airborne formations are operating, which indicates the strategic importance of this bridgehead for the Russian command. Overall, the situation is difficult but under control. The armed forces of Ukraine, despite everything, continue to hold the line. That's all for today. Tune in tomorrow for more news.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
Urgent! The Ukrainian delegation is already in the United States. This visit will change everything. Washington is on the line. Exclusive details of this crucial meeting coming up in just a minute. Trump hints at participating in a possible meeting between Putin and Zelensky. But there's a catch. Peskov has already leaked that the meeting is unlikely. Medvedev threatens retaliation over Operation Web. The negotiations in Istanbul were not for peace, but for victory.
The second round of Ukrainian-Russian negotiations took place in Turkey.
As in the first meeting, the result was an exchange of prisoners of war. Now, the results we have are to release all prisoners of war who are under the age of 25.
They plan to exchange the severely wounded and seriously ill according to the same formula, all for all. Ukraine handed over to the Russian side a list of 339 children who were abducted by Russia. The Russians promised to forward it to their ombudsman's office and to reunite the families. Ukraine will also receive back 6,000 bodies of its defenders. What they did not agree on was a ceasefire, not for a 30-day ceasefire as the US is requesting, nor for a 2- or 3-day one which the Russians want.
Russia needs to offer something in response to Trump's request, after all. That is, Trump is talking about 30 days, but Russia says, let's not do 30, but 2 or 3. But this is, to put it mildly, a deception. This is a distortion of the terms. In other words, you're replacing a 30-day ceasefire, which is significant, with just 2 or 3 days. 2 or 3 days are needed to regroup troops, to amass certain forces for the next strikes. So naturally, everyone understands why Russia wants those 2 or 3 days. That's why Ukraine does not agree to these terms. We want a more, let's say, comprehensive solution. And 30 days is not exactly comprehensive, but at the very least, it's more serious. At the very least, it creates a foundation for considering and observing whether the sides are ready for peace.
Holding elections and surrendering illegally seized Ukrainian territories, which the Russians dismissively call Novorossiya, are the demands of the Russian side to begin peace negotiations.
Any election always brings a certain division within society, because when the election process takes place, people split up according to their political, let's say, preferences. Naturally, at such moments, it's easier to attack a country when it is divided. I believe that elections will definitely take place in Ukraine, but not after the kind of agreement that exists with Russia, rather after the war with Russia is over.
The president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, called the members of the Russian delegation at the negotiations in Istanbul idiots after Russia proposed a 2- or 3-day ceasefire so that both sides could retrieve the bodies of fallen soldiers.
Ukraine wants peace, that's clear. But Ukraine is not ready to sacrifice its own interests. As for Russia, their situation is much more complicated, because if Russia now announces that it is ending the war, it would mean that a large number of people whom it sent to fight in Ukraine and who are being paid huge sums of money for participating in this war would have to return home to salaries that are 10 to 15 times lower than what they are currently receiving. And these would be people with weapons in their hands and, most importantly, with experience in using them.
The president of Ukraine added that Moscow is trying to imitate diplomacy in order to delay the imposition of American sanctions against Russia. Zelensky supports Recep Erdogan's idea of a meeting with the presidents of Russia, the US, and Turkey, but he believes that a ceasefire will not result from the meeting, even if it does take place.
Shock, and Poland as well. This decision changed everything. A blow from where it was least expected, an anti-Ukrainian president. Ukrainian refugees should be prepared. Ukraine has lost an ally. Now even Poland will speak with Putin's voice. What awaits Ukraine and Ukrainians in Poland in reality? Watch in this episode.
A conservative and opposition figure has replaced the pro-European Andrzej Duda. Karol Nawrocki won in the second round of the elections. He received 50.89% of the votes. The gap with his opponent was minimal, less than 2%. But that was enough to change the entire political direction of Poland, singing in a foreign language, their own. President in Kolsko I was born in Russia. President in Polsko. Karol Nawrocki begins his final rally before the vote near the monument to the victims of the Volhynia tragedy in southeastern Poland. A historian, a worker's son, director of the Institute of National Remembrance, and a boxer. He does not intend to leave this historical issue in relations with Kiev, accusing Ukraine of the genocide of 120,000 Poles, although not a single academic work confirms such numbers. Karol Nawrocki is a man who was not afraid to say Ukraine has no place in the EU or NATO until it repents before Poland. He built his campaign on historical grievances and actively participated in rallies with a distinctly anti-Ukrainian and anti-European stance.
Today I do not see Ukraine in any structure, neither in the European Union nor in NATO. A state that is unable to answer for its crimes cannot be part of the alliance.
It was precisely the promise to hold back Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic integration that brought the candidate support from far-right voters.
Ukrainian skeptics have become more active in Poland, and quite significantly.
In 2018, Nawrocki traveled to Moscow after the annexation of Crimea and the fighting in the east. Officially, it was for a scientific conference. Unofficially, no one knows. There are no photos, no reports. This sparked a wave of suspicion and speculation, from unofficial meetings with Russian representatives to assumptions about possible recruitment by Russian intelligence services. He is supported by the most well-known conservatives. Among them are the chief Ukraine hater, Viktor Orban, and US President Donald Trump. He went to pay his respects to the latter during his election campaign. At that time, the 47th president gave his blessing to the Polish candidate, saying, "You will win." And this is the same candidate who, during a televised debate, took a dose of snus.
He took off his mask and said, "Friends, today we see here 100% Ukrainians who voted for us."
His opponent, the pro-European candidate Rafał Trzaskowski, in turn, stated that Ukraine should be a buffer zone between Russia and the West. At the same time, he supported Ukraine's accession to NATO and the EU. While Rafał Trzaskowski was supported by the current Polish Prime Minister and pro-European integration advocate Donald Tusk, Karol Nawrocki was backed by representatives of the Law and Justice Party, a nationalist political force that had governed the country for many years.
But overall, it can also indeed be said that in a broader sense, Poland as a whole, in today's voting, in today's elections, this is also in many ways a vote of confidence in the government coalition, the coalition that was elected and formed the government of Donald Tusk on October 15, 2023. This factor should not be overlooked in the analysis because many people say one side has formed the government, so the political system needs to be balanced by the president. That way we will get more from the state as a whole.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky congratulated Karol Nawrocki. The head of state expressed hope for fruitful cooperation with his new Polish counterpart.
Congratulations to Karol Nawrocki on his victory in the presidential elections. Poland, which preserves the strength of its national spirit and faith in justice, has been and remains a pillar of regional and pan-European security, as well as a powerful voice defending the freedom and dignity of every nation. By strengthening each other on our continent, we give Europe more power in global competition and bring the achievement of real and lasting peace closer. I count on consistently fruitful cooperation with Poland and personally with Mr. President. It is obvious that, in order to win, he had to borrow some of the slogans of the far right, but that does not mean that all this rhetoric will be put into practice. It is already clear the political elites in Poland, whether they are in the coalition or in the opposition, share a common understanding of the threats from Russia and the importance of supporting Ukraine.
Nawrocki became the president of the country that was the first to extend a helping hand to Ukraine in 2022. Millions of Ukrainians found refuge in Poland. And now, at the helm is a person who does not believe in a shared European future, neither with Kiev nor with Brussels. But how relations between the new president, the EU and Ukraine will develop remains to be seen.
It's hard to believe, but this is reality. The Ukrainian Shahed is already in service. The Batyar UAV is the latest development from our engineers. A strike drone with the same specifications as its Iranian counterpart, but with Ukrainian character and precision. This isn't science fiction, it's a new threat to the Jiran. The Ukrainian armed forces are receiving a powerful tool that changes the rules of the game.
The Ukrainian Shahed is no longer a fantasy or just a demand from the public to Ukrainian developers. Now it's a reality called the Batyar UAV. Engineers say that just 6 months ago it existed only on paper. Today it's a fully developed drone that has passed testing and is ready for mass production.
Ukraine now holds a leading position in drone manufacturing worldwide. No other country in the world produces more drones than Ukraine. We produce more than China, and we manufacture using localized Ukrainian components.
It is known that the Batyar drone has a range of 800 kilometers. That, by the way, is farther than the distance, for example, to Krasnodar, Voronezh, Volgograd or Saratov. And of course, it easily covers the distance to Moscow. Originally, the drone was conceived as a strike kamikaze UAV for long-range attacks. However, during development, the Ukrainian Shahed was made universal.
We can use the same drone as a decoy, a bomber, or as a frontline kamikaze drone. It all depends on the payload we put on it and the software we use.
It's almost impossible not to notice that the drone itself is visually and technically similar to the Shahed. And the designers don't hide the fact that they use the Iranian design as a basis, but replace the components with Ukrainian and Western ones.
If we're talking specifically about this drone, yes, it's smaller, but it looks very similar to the Iranian Shahed because of the wing geometry and certain design features. In Russia, they just stick a label on it. And when we talk about its future use, in principle, this drone can effectively hit targets located at such a distance.
The warhead of the drone is also among its known characteristics. Here, however, it is significantly inferior to the original Shaheds modified by the Russians. 18 kilograms versus 50, and in some cases even 90 kilograms. However, experts say that Ukraine developed this weapon not against civilians but against military targets, and this warhead is sufficient for such purposes. It's more than enough.
Not a single Shahed has reached a military target throughout the entire full-scale war. It is always a weapon of terror, specifically intended to disrupt our lives. Accordingly, when we create any equipment, we immediately state that Ukrainian engineers are designing it to target the enemy's military infrastructure.
One of the main tasks the developers recall was to create a lightweight drone. By the way, the Batyar ended up weighing only 60 kilograms. It was also important that the UAV could be launched from a catapult or a vehicle in order to eliminate the need for bulky launch systems. This was also successfully implemented. However, the developers consider its guidance system to be its standout feature. It is claimed that when diving steeply toward a target, the drone is able to stay on course and strike precisely at the designated coordinates, even if it has been damaged. At the same time, it is known that the Batyar is far from the only Ukrainian analog of the Shahed. Naturally, not all developments are revealed to the general public. However, the Ukrainian armed forces will soon see a significant increase in the number of drones based on this platform.
Currently, in total, around 5 to 10 different manufacturers have presented their drones, which in terms of specifications are actually close to, or at least comparable with, Shahed drones, both in flight range and in the types of munitions they can carry.
As for those critics who complain about the Batyar's smaller warhead compared to Russian Shaheds, it's important to understand that Ukraine is not repeating Russia's approach by fixating on upgrading a single type of drone. For different tasks, the defense forces use different types of drones, including ones with much larger warheads, and importantly, these are also produced in Ukraine.
As of today, when it comes to Ukrainian drones, their range has now surpassed 100 different models.
And the principle our engineers follow, making things simpler but in greater numbers, allows us to produce domestic drones not just by the thousands, but by the hundreds of thousands each month. The same fate awaits the Batyar UAV.
That's all for today. Subscribe, leave a like, and write your comments. And catch other news in the next episode of Hotspot.